those seatbelts because these people are going to take us on a wild ride. Here is part 2 of the top 10 terrifying things people did to survive. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Hugh Glass. I'm not gonna lie, when I first saw this name pop up as I was doing research for this video, I thought it was one of those prank names, but turns out it 100% is not, and I just suck. Anyway, Hugh Glass was an American fur trapper, trader, and hunter, as well as an explorer, which, given the time frame of his life, 1783 to 1833, we can all imagine exactly what that would have looked like if you catch my drift. If you've seen The Man in the Wilderness or The Revenant, you'll be kind of familiar with this story. So basically, Hugh and some other men were out on a fur trading adventure, and at some point in the journey, they regrouped at Fort Kiowa before setting out to Yellowstone River, but as they were searching for animals to hunt, Hugh accidentally stumbled upon and subsequently disturbed a grizzly bear who was with her 2 cubs, which we all know is a bad scenario. The bear charged at him, bit him, slashed him up, you know, exactly what you think happens when someone is being mauled by a bear. Despite this attack, Hugh, with the help of the other men, was able to fend off this bear, but he was left with some serious injuries. The group carried him for a while, but they realized that doing this was slowing them down, and at this point they were convinced that he was going to die from his injuries. This is when the leader asked for 2 volunteers to stay behind with him until he passed away, and then to bury him, which 2 people stepped up to do. Then, because of what the 2 volunteers would later claim to be a sort of ambush attack, the 2 men grabbed Hugh's rifle and knife and basically all of his equipment and ran out of there and went to catch up with the rest of the group, where they then falsely told them that Hugh had died. He was able to regain consciousness, but now he found himself abandoned, and he had festering wounds, a broken leg, and deep cuts on his back that exposed his bare ribs. He set the bones in his leg, he allowed the maggots in his wound to continue eating the dead flesh so as to try and prevent gangrene, which is disgusting, and then he began crawling the 200-some-mile journey back to Fort Kiowa. He crawled toward the Cheyenne River, where he made himself a sort of float device, and then he floated downstream towards the fort. Not only did he survive a bear attack, but then he survived after being abandoned for 6 weeks, and he actually made it back alive. In our number 9 spot today, we have MAURO Prosperi. MAURO Prosperi is an Italian police officer who got lost in the Sahara Desert in 1994 while doing the Marathon of the Sands in Morocco. This marathon is a 6-day-long endurance race in one of the most dry and barren places in the entire world. During the race, a sandstorm hit and caused MAURO to become disoriented, and he lost his way. One day after going missing, he found an abandoned Muslim shrine in Algeria, and he used it as shelter from the sun. He killed and ate bats to survive, and for hydration, he had to drink his own urine. He licked dew off of the rocks, and he sucked moisture out of the wet wipes he had with him. After failing to be seen and rescued by 2 different aircrafts that flew right over him, he figured he would never be found, and he tried to take his own life. The heat in the desert, however, is so dry that the wounds clotted, and he thankfully survived this attempt. For 9 days, he walked through the desert and ate insects and reptiles. Finally, he found a small group of nomadic people, and they took him to the nearest village. From there, he was flown to the hospital, where doctors said his liver had almost completely failed. Having traveled 180 miles in total, Prosperi lost 35 pounds in body weight, and it took years for him to fully recover. But despite all of this, he has remained an enthusiastic runner and even returned and completed the same race a few times. In our number 8 spot today, we have Peter Skylberg. In February of 2012, 2 snowmobilers made quite the discovery when they saw a car that was trapped in the snow. They began to dig this car out, and that is when they realized that this car had a man in the back seat, and he was alive. It isn't quite clear how or why, but 44-year-old Peter somehow got his car trapped underneath all of this snow, and this is where he spent 2 months before the snowmobilers were able to rescue him. 2 months in a trapped car. Peter told doctors that he survived without food by just eating snow and staying inside of his warm clothes and sleeping bag. The temperatures around the time of him being found were as low as -30 degrees Celsius, which had people wondering how he didn't freeze, and this is thanks to what people referred to as the igloo effect. The snowed-in car is probably exactly what shielded him from the elements, just enough to ensure that he didn't freeze. No one is quite sure exactly how he survived, but but some suspect he may have gone into a sort of hibernation. Either way, because of the snow and his adequate water intake, 2 months is definitely getting close to as long as a person can go without food, so thankfully he was found when he was. In our number 7 spot today, we have Michael Benson. In 1992, as Michael Benson and Chris Duddy were in a helicopter over an active volcano in Hawaii, shooting some aerial footage for a movie, the helicopter crashed. It is said that the helicopter lost power so suddenly that they didn't even have time to radio for help. This led to the 2 men and the pilot Craig Hosking being stuck inside of the volcano, just missing a bubbling pool of lava. The pilot and Chris were able to get out of the volcano not too long after the crash, but the same couldn't be said for Michael. The volcano emits a ton of noxious gases, but luckily where the men ended up was in a part of the crater that enough fresh air could also reach. Michael didn't know that the other 2 men were already out of the volcano, and he was extremely worried that they had perished, all the while of course being worried about his own fate. He tried to pass the time and calm himself down by reciting the alphabet backwards. He prayed. When it rained, he cupped his hands to collect the drinking water, but none of this could distract him from the sudden small eruptions and bubbling lava below. After 2 days with no food or sleep had passed, Michael thought he was at his end, but rescue helicopter pilot Tom Hauptmann was able to see Michael through a small momentary break in the steam before the fog all took over again. They knew where he was, but they had to go in to save him with no visibility. Almost 2 hours after being spotted, Michael was able to make it into the safety net, where he was then lifted out of the volcano. He recalls a triumphant feeling as he left. In our number 6 spot today, we have Matthew Allen. Okay, when I was a kid, every time I was mad at my parents or brothers, I thought about getting a stick, tying a little handkerchief around it filled with my most precious belongings, and running away forever to live a life in the wild jungles of Saskatchewan. I thought about doing that, but never did, because I would quickly be reminded of how I would absolutely not be able to even get down the block before turning right back around. Unfortunately, however, the same could not be said for Matthew Allen. In December of 2012, the teenager at the time, like most of us during our teenage years at some point, got tired of his parents' rules and restrictions on his life and decided to run away from home. But aside from how just running away is a terrible idea in general, the timing was also just all wrong. He ran away during a record-breaking heat wave, and after running away, the 18-year-old went missing for 9 weeks. By the time he was found by some hikers, he was lost in the Australian outback, disoriented, unable to stand, and he had lost half of his body weight. He was surviving solely on creek water. He was extremely lucky to have survived for as long as he did, and he really just made it. Thank goodness for whatever led those hikers there that day, because he was cutting it extremely close. In our number 5 spot today, we have Jose Salvador Alvarenga. On December 17th, 2012, Jose set out on a professional fishing trip with a young fisherman named Ezekiel Cordoba. They planned the trip to take around 30 hours, and they were setting out to hunt tuna, mahi-mahi, and sharks. Just a few short hours into their trip, however, things went awry when a storm struck that lasted 5 days, and it of course blew them way off course. Jose of course radioed into his boss to call for help, but unfortunately the radio had been totally disabled by the storm, as well as the rest of the boat's electronics, and the motor was also badly damaged. When the men didn't return, a search party was sent out, but it only lasted 2 days before being called off because they just assumed the men had already passed away. The 2 men survived by eating raw fish, turtles, and jellyfish, and they drank rainwater and turtle blood, but the weeks quickly turned to months and there was still no sign of rescue. This is when the young fisherman fell ill from the raw food diet and he sadly passed away. Jose was now on his own and he managed to survive another 9 months alone at sea until he finally spotted a small island. He abandoned the boat and swam all the way to shore. He had reached the Marshall Islands and he met a local couple who immediately alerted the authorities. He survived out there for 438 days, and it is estimated that he covered somewhere between 5,500 to 6,700 miles. In our number 4 spot today, we have Douglas Mawson. Douglas was another person who was called an explorer, and he was also a geologist. He is most well known perhaps for his face being on the paper $100 note in Australia, but part of the reason he landed that gig is due to this story. In December of 1912, Douglas, along with 2 other explorers, set off on an expedition meant to explore the interior of the Antarctic, but unfortunately, only pure tragedy ensued. First, one of the explorers, Belgrave Ninnis, fell into a crevasse along with most of the group's best dogs and a ton of their supplies. The other 2 now had to push on without most of their food and equipment in the unforgiving environment that they were in. The 2 fell ill with things like scurvy, and they were struggling to get back to their camp, and they ended up surviving for a while by eating the dogs that remained with them, and then they just barely scraped by on the rest rest of their food portioned out with starvation rations. The other explorer, Xavier Mertz, ended up passing away from exhaustion, starvation, and people also assumed the possibility of toxicity from consuming the dog's liver. In the end, Doug battled the elements for about 30 days before he finally made it back to camp in February of 1913. But when he got there, he realized that he was frostbitten, skeletal, exhausted, and that he had also missed the ship that was retrieving the rest of the crew by just hours. To add a little more drama to this one, there are rumors that he may have kind of sabotaged Mertz's starvation rations that would have, quote, hastened his death so that he could consume his final companion, but that is all rumors and it has never been substantiated, so we'll just assume that that is untrue. In our number 3 spot today, we have Truman Duncan. In June of 2006, Truman, who was a switchman, headed into work for another day of working on the trains. During the workday, he ended up accidentally falling and landing in between moving railroad freight cars. This ended up leaving Truman trapped under the wheels, which not only cut off his legs, but also sliced through his pelvis bone. He somehow, absolutely miraculously, stayed alive, stayed conscious, and was able to pull out his phone and call 911. Some speculate that perhaps the weight of the car is what prevented him from bleeding out, but regardless of whatever it was, it truly is incredible. He ended up losing his legs, his pelvis, and a kidney, but the most important thing is that he didn't lose his life. No one is really exactly sure how he survived, but it definitely had to do something with Truman's ability to stay calm and call for help, even in a situation I couldn't even imagine being faced with. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mary Vincent. Mary Vincent's story starts out in September of 1978 when she was hitchhiking to her grandpa's house in California. She was on the side of the road with a group of other hitchhikers, which is exactly why it was weird when a blue van pulled up and the man inside claimed he could only take Mary with him. Huge red flag right there, which Mary definitely picked up on, but this being the 70s coupled with her young age and the fact that she just wanted to get to her destination is what caused her to still accept the ride. As the drive went on, Mary ended up falling asleep, and when she awoke, she quickly realized the nightmare she was in, as she realized they were now in Nevada, not California. She began to panic, but the man driving assured her it was just an honest mistake. Yeah, I pick up random strangers all the time without knowing where I'm going and somehow end up in another state. Yeah, no worries, Mr. Weirdo. The next time they stopped, the man ended up attacking Mary. He then threw her out of the car and proceeded to cut her arms off with a hatchet. At this point, she was now unconscious, and he put her body, assuming she was going to or already had passed away, into a concrete pipe and down an embankment. After he left, Mary regained consciousness and realized that she could not just give up and stay there because no one would find her. She got up and climbed up to the road, all the while holding her arms up in order to slow the bleeding. She was able to flag down a car and was rushed to the hospital. She not only survived, but testified against the man in court. Mary continues to live a happy, fulfilled life after surviving what many people would call the impossible. In our number 1 spot today, we have ALISON BOTHA. Sometimes I hear a story that I truly cannot believe is real, and Mary's was definitely one of those, and ALISON's story is also absolutely one of them. She is a woman unlike any other, and this survival story starts out in her home in South Africa in December of 1994. She was 27 years old at the time, and after a night out with friends, she drove back to her apartment, and when she parked her car, a man with a knife ended up forcing his way inside. The man forced her over into the other seat, and he began to drive her car with her inside to go and pick up some sort of accomplice. These two absolute monsters, who really don't even deserve to be named, took ALISON to a deserted area on the outskirts of town and did some of the most violent and disgusting things I've ever heard that I absolutely cannot repeat here on YouTube, and then they just simply left her for dead. At this moment, ALISON was still breathing, despite having been disemboweled, and I'm not even making this up, despite being nearly decapitated. And not only was she still alive after these injuries, but she also said, quote, "I realized my life was too valuable to let go of, and that gave me the courage to survive." This is when ALISON not only wrote the names she knew her attackers by in the dirt, with "I love mom" below, just in case she didn't survive, but she also saw headlights in the distance, and she knew that this was her chance. She started to pull herself up, and this is when she realized how injured she really was. I kid you not, ALISON held her intestines in with one of her hands and used her other hand to hold her head onto her body, and she made her way towards the headlights. Thankfully, a young veterinary student named Tian Ellard was on the road that night, and he saw ALISON and stopped to help her. He used his vet knowledge to help keep her alive until emergency services arrived, and the doctor at the hospital where ALISON was taken said, in reference to her injuries, that they were the most severe he's ever seen. Not only did ALISON survive, but she also remembered so much about her attackers that she was able to lead them right to the police. The two are spending the rest of their lives survives in prison, while Alison uses her voice and her experience to empower and motivate others around the world. Alison is truly a remarkable human being that I am absolutely in awe of. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!